My name is Elizabeth Rohn. I am a doctoral student at Texas State University studying mathematics education. And I'm specifically looking at mathematical modeling and ways to teach mathematical modeling. Dr. Yao?
My name is Guangming Yao. I came to Clarkson University since 2012. Now I'm an associate professor at Clarkson in mathematics. And I would say I learned to teach with modeling as I go along since 2012. I joined Clarkson University. But my research is focusing on computational differential equations.
I guess we don't have too many people here, so if anybody would like to specifically introduce themselves, that would be a good time. If not, I'll just go on to the flow.
Do we start like introducing ourselves one at a time? So we have 12 participants currently.
Oh, that is quite a bit.
So do we go like take turn at a time? So shall I start with myself?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
So I am Aditi. I'm Aditi Ghosh from University of Wisconsin Whitewater. I'm an applied mathematician and I teach modeling differential equations, complex variables in UW Whitewater. And I'm a modeling enthusiast and I'm hoping to learn so many things from you guys today.
Anybody else would like to? You don't have to. I'm not going to make you.
I thought you would have to.
I'm not going to make anybody. It's a free and open space to talk.
I'll say hi. I'm Rebecca Siegel from Virginia Commonwealth University, and I teach applied math, specifically mathematical biology is my main focus. Currently teaching an intro differential equations course this semester, primarily with engineering students. So I'm always looking at ways to make the course more relevant for their career trajectory.
Excellent. I'm not seeing anybody. Oh, yes.
I'll jump in. I'm Ann Walter at St. Olaf College, and I'm a biologist, but I do co-teach a mathematical biology course and currently direct our mathematical biology concentration, like a minor. So that's my reason for being.
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Kristen. I teach at Penn State New Kensington outside of Pittsburgh, and I'm teaching differential equations to engineering students. So excited about applying things.
I'll say that the goal of this panel necessarily is I will be kind of discussing some of the research findings I've had with 10 different interviews of STEM instructors. Those STEM instructors come from geologists, anthropologists, psychologists, and economists to kind of give a different perspective from people who are teaching modeling but aren't necessarily heard in research literature. I'll say the kind of the flow of how this panel is how I see it, is I'll present a question for everybody to think about. I'll present some of my findings, my research findings kind of about that question. And then I'll have Dr. Yao kind of talk about her perspective on that question. And then we'll open the floor for a while to talk about everybody else's answer to that question. The first question is, what drives you to add modeling tasks into your coursework? So my hypothesis, which might seem like a little bit of a no-brainer, is having a positive, impactful experience in mathematics might make one have a stronger resolve to implement modeling in the classroom. I think it's a little more of an impactful statement if we put this into context. So I'll talk about a geologist named Parker, pseudonym, and an economist named Carter. I didn't realize how similar those names were until I put them in here. First, I'll talk about Parker. So Parker is a professor at a university, in the geology department. He mainly researches qualitatively hazards, which is how people think and react to weather hazards like tornadoes, big freezes, and other types of natural disasters. He originally wanted to be a park ranger when he was in college. He double majored in geography and math for that reason, but he noticed that around that time, national park rangers were becoming more like police officers, so he decided he was just going to go get his master's and his PhD. He commented upon reflection that he used models in his dissertation for predicting pests and the distributions of pesticides. He had never really thought of that as a mathematical model until our conversation. He had said that as a student, he was always very partial to mathematics. He always found it really easy because he seemed to have a logical mind to understanding these things. Now his experience with modeling is almost as a secondhand person. He is an editor essentially for a big group of geographers in a foreign country, and they write a bunch of different papers about predicting patterns of physical phenomena like corrosion, landslides, dust storms. And over the past 3 years, he's co-authored about 80 papers with these people. His role is mostly as an editor for their English. So in exchange for editing, he gets a co-authorship instead of any form of payment. I felt like the story was important to talk about because this defines what experiences are salient for him when he's discussing mathematics. It's not the things that he's doing in his research. It's not the things that he's teaching. It's, oh, I'm an editor for these other people who are doing modeling. This seems to kind of indicate that modeling, he doesn't feel like that's necessarily important for his field of interest. And that kind of bleeds into the classes that he teaches. He said that at a level at which I'm teaching this material, math and modeling, is kind of far from what I would think of as an advanced engagement in the subject matter. He kind of thinks of this statement as he's teaching math, but he's not really discussing the in-depth math behind it. A lot of this comes from what he said as students' level of preparedness. He seemed to be kind of frustrated with his students in that he said if he put actual modeling tasks into his coursework, it would be more of an exposure to modeling because it would be wrought with failure if he tried. So this seems to indicate that his experiences in modeling, trying to put this into the coursework, has not been successful, and now he feels a little burned out, and he's more conscious of the consequences his students would have if he were to fail his class. So he's, oh, these students are successful at it. I don't want them to fail and not graduate, so I just won't do it. We'll put that as beside Carter, who is a macroeconomics professor. He came from from South Africa, in a not well-to-do family. He talked about how to study mathematics, he would have a candle and study by candlelight up until like 5 a.m. sometimes because he wanted to do really well and he needed to learn it to get a scholarship that only went to the top 1% of a certain national test so that he could go to university. For him, math and economics are so tied together that he does not see any way in which they could be talked about separately. So he is very forceful in putting modeling into his classroom. He's very adamant about it. And when he talks about his students maybe not being prepared enough or not willing to do it, he talks more about his goal of motivating them to learn this because he thinks it's so important. So he always tells them the story of how, oh, I came from a very, a foreign country where I had to study by candlelight. I stayed up super late. If I can do it, you can do it too, in a place of sympathy. I want to emphasize that I'm not saying these two different people, one is bad over the other, or anything like that. I'm saying these are two different experiences and they have consequences for how they're putting modeling into their classroom. So now I want to ask, Dr. Yao, why did you decide to put modeling in your classroom?
So when I first started teaching differential equation class, that's elementary differential equation, we had 2 years of no modeling or projects in our classes, and we just have monthly exams, final exam, pretty much homework, and that will be it. But later on, we feel uh, elementary differential equation class can be a class where you have a lot interesting projects for students to work on, especially if students have solid foundation in calculus integrations, differentiations. They can easily get the concepts in differential equation class. But what motivates them more is that seeing what are those equations coming from. And another professor who was co-teaching with me, Professor Kelly Black, he was more experienced professor, and he proposed to have a project, and I think it was a really good idea. And the Clarkson is a engineer school focused on engineering students, and we had some engineer projects, but I think it's really interesting to just add simple biology projects into differential equation class, even if they were not interested in biology, but they were motivated learning what is the meaning of this piece of equation and then how to solve it. After you solve it, how do you represent that solution in real life in terms of the biology? So it was really interesting, and I think students were struggling at beginning. Of course, you need to give them a lot of guidance, but I think overall it's possible, positive feedback from students. So I kind of get into adding projects into my classes, sometimes more guided projects, sometimes more open-ended, but I think I like the idea of adding modeling into every possible course I actually teaching in mathematics.
Wonderful stories. Now I'll ask everybody, what drives you to add modeling tasks into your coursework? Do I have to be like a teacher and start like calling people out? I'll do it.
I mean, for me, it's I find it more interesting to teach. And so to me, that makes it a more engaging class because I am excited to show the students how differential equations are actually relevant and useful and what I do with them. And then, bring those examples to a level that they can actually solve the equations and use the techniques that I'm trying to teach them. And so that's a big motivation for me. And I do also think, like you said, it helps the students buy into it, to the coursework in a different way. So.
An excellent story. Anybody else like to share?
I can say that as a biologist who doesn't introduce a lot of modeling in my biology classes, but I do some, it really helps to clarify the system, particularly when you have something messy. So if students have to do the very first steps, like describe the parts, what's moving, what's not moving, what can we measure? It really helps them focus on what they're learning instead of having a big jumble in their mind. So whether we get to the math or not, which is a big hang up, like your geology colleague, the articulation of the problem is really, really important.
That's an excellent point to add, that it's important to be able to actually say what that problem is first in the first place.
Like this, it helps me to answer something. For example, whenever you go to a conference or anywhere you present something, your research, the first question or the second question that comes to one is, what is the application of your research? Right? And for hardcore mathematicians, I mean, they get stuck at that. Like, they would come up with answers very vague. We can apply it in software, we can do this and do that. But when you do really practical driven mathematics, this is where you find the fun and the engagement. Students engage themselves in the problem, they take ownership of the problems. And I think that is a plus for us mathematicians, applied mathematicians, to tell them why mathematics is helpful. Like, for example, in the current COVID situation, I kind of had 2 or 3 projects with my students, and they found it relevant that math is helping them to understand what a basic reproductive number is. How do we understand the number of infected susceptibles rising up or down? So it is that basic understanding, the logical understanding, that is making them getting used to a current epidemic, not only in through news, but also through the subject they're learning. So the relevant application, I think, makes me work on a modeling class more enthusiastically than I would do other classes. That's my take on it.
That's a lovely story. This kind of bleeds into this next question that many people are kind of bringing up is, what are some of the barriers that you're experiencing when you're adding modeling into the classroom? One of the ones that I saw a lot of in my interviews was this idea of mathematical preparedness. How much math do they actually need before I'm able to talk about different models? But what does mathematical preparedness even really mean? So here I'll present 2 stories. There's Haven, a psychologist. She is this assistant professor in the psychology department, and she researches social cognition and how we think and reason about social situations. So she's doing a lot of modeling with different people in the way that they're thinking in a neural network kind of way. For the most part, she says she teaches a lot of undergraduate classes, and a lot of those undergraduate classes have 100 or more so students in them. She says because there's no statistic prerequisite or a math prerequisite for that course that she teaches, she can't really dive into the things that she really wants to. And that kind of brought up to the point of, well, what math did you really need to have this conversation in the first place? And she always talked about basic statistics and strong, solid algebra skills. Put that into comparison, I talked to Emerson, who is another economist, and he studies macroeconomics on capital flows. And he is very adamant, again, about putting modeling into his classroom. In fact, he was petitioning to put a theoretical modeling course into the economics sequence so that these students would get more of a modeling chance. But whenever he talked about what the students needed, he always really talked about calculus, beginning calculus at least, for derivatives to do the optimization problems. But even then, when he was talking about that, he didn't necessarily consider optimization as a modeling practice. He was just like, oh, it's just something that you do. It's too simple to be considered an actual modeling problem. So with that in mind, what are some of the barriers that you experienced when actually putting modeling into the classroom?
So for me, for differential equation class, I feel like we give them a model or a base model, and the students can work on the base model or further to improve it, make their own model. So with that base model, students were able to actually produce some reasonable report, because at the end, we ask students to write a report and then we evaluated the report. That was pretty good experience. But later on, I switched to teach Calculus 1, Calculus 2. Especially, I had this NSF funding on calculus, teaching calculus together with physics. So I was trying to introduce a lot of physics concepts into my calculus courses. And calculus 1 was the one that with physics together that was tied really well together. But for calculus 2, I rarely find some good physical examples for students. But anyhow, for calculus, students are freshman students. I find it hard for students to actually write a reasonable technical paper. And that was actually the main problem in my mind, that uh, students are asked to write a technical paper, but they are not really at that stage. So we are actually spending a lot of time focusing on guiding them how to write a technical paper, even though the mathematics behind is pretty simple, like calculus or even some linear model. But students were not able to actually write a technical paper. Not mention technical paper. If you ask students to write a solution, they don't see solution is different than the final number they got from that problem. So that was the main problem for our calculus projects. And I hope in the future we were able to actually develop some smaller projects that has more guided steps. Of course, it's less open-ended, but it helps them to actually format the whole process into a few steps. Say step 1, you do this model. Step 2, you do this calculation. Step 3, you tell me what is that conclusion trying to say in real life. Probably it will be better experience just compared to just give them a problem, ask them to solve it in their own way. But our calculus course is a coordinated calculus course. So for the projects, 2 projects each semester, that we don't really have our own projects. It's a group projects that every students get. Probably it's harder to change, but probably in the future for some small classes, I would like to try to have some smaller projects that has more guidance into it.
Excellent. So we'll kind of push the question onto the audience and everybody else. What are some of the barriers that you've been experiencing when adding modeling tasks into your coursework? Not all at once.
It's all right.
We've said so far that maybe some students aren't mathematically prepared enough, whatever that means for whatever course you're teaching. Some of the writing skills haven't necessarily been up to par for the students whenever they're doing these modeling tasks. One thing I know people aren't mentioning is the idea of actually writing a model. Oh, there's the chat.
Yes.
I can't see the chat. Let me pull up the chat.
Yes.
And I also think personally, like problem formulation, that is also a challenge, and it's very conceptual. Like, do you give them the problem, or they should come up with their own problem, what interests them? I think to me that is a great challenge. And personally, I prefer kind of making students think about the interest, whether it's an environmental thing that they would like to do or epidemiological stuff. And they should come up with their own thing. And I believe like an organic formulation of questions, that is kind of like more effective in terms of overall learning. It adds to your learning growth also, as well as gives you a confidence that you can interpret a real life problem mathematically.
Excellent. Kristen, sorry, I almost said your name wrong. I didn't see you in the chat, but I like how you were saying students compartmentalizing. I can't say that word today. The material and wanting to see the material as a tool, especially in places that you can use in multiple different ways, right? I think that's kind of what you're saying. And I agree with that. As students are saying, oh, I need to know this for this test. And then after that, I won't remember it anymore. I don't need that in this other context, or they won't think of something if they're in another class. They're like, oh, this was calculus. And they're like, I don't remember anything from calculus. I'm sure that's a very common thing people have been hearing. So, with all of these things in mind, we'll spend the last bit of time here, and we have quite a bit of time, just thinking and workshopping ways that we can overcome some of these barriers. So, what are the ways that you guys have, put together and tried to come up with different ways?
So one other difficulty I found was that the instructor has to spend a lot of time to come up with some projects that's relevant to what they're teaching. It's time consuming and it takes a lot of time to actually grading those projects. And it's not really suitable for big classes. Elementary, like if you have a class over 100 students, then probably you want to group the students into 2 to 3 students group, and so that you have around 50 papers to grade instead of over 100 papers to grade. And in addition to that, I think it's also hard, like students do find it difficult. It's rather easy to learn a problem, how to solve it step by step in 10 steps, than writing a paper that I don't know how to start it. So some students actually finding other sources without citing it, and you have to deal with a lot of those academic integrity problems. And we use Turnitin on Moodle at Clarkson. You can find papers similarities between students in the same group. Like all the Clarkson students, for first year students, you have to turn in a paper. Uh, they can check across the whole cohort, but they cannot check over past cohort. So students live in a house will copy from the students who submit their report last year. Then you wouldn't know. And I actually found one last year just because I asked them more open-ended problem, and then students come up with exact same model we were asking them last year. We asked them to design a special shape with certain requirements of a 3D solid, and then students were actually doing exactly what we were asking them last year. And it's just so time consuming to deal with all those other things. But still, for me, I feel like it's worth the trouble, but probably team with other faculty is a better idea than working it on yourself.
I assume finding projects is a very common problem a lot of people have. We know that SIMIODE has its bank of different modeling problems to use. I know there's a publication, the Primus publication, that does upload some different modeling tasks as well. It's actually what my research group is doing, is designing other modeling projects as well. So that's kind of a fun thing to hear that we're needed. Has anybody found a way to think? Oh, that's a good question. Do you change, Dr. Ya, do you change the project every year?
We do, but sometimes we recycle those after a few years. Like if a project was asked 3 years ago, then we will ask them again. Of course, we always change it a little bit, but we do recycle those. We use those in the future. We do have a good bank of calculus projects. So usually for calculus, we don't pick our own projects. We use those banks, except if you want to design a new one, then you propose it to the whole group, and then we polish it together. But for higher level classes like differential equation class, linear algebra class, most of time you come up with those projects by yourself. Some professors are more willing to share their projects that they designed, but some professor will say, those are my personal investment. I don't want to share it. Then, of course, the textbooks usually has good examples. Of course, if you pick a good textbook, some big examples or larger project suggestions I usually turn those problems into a project. Of course, expand it a little bit, use the same example, but expand it into larger applications or some special perspective. Yeah, we do recycle those. We don't really have time to design projects every semester, design a new one, so that we have to deal with the copyright problems. But I'm willing to share anything that I have. I have taught linear algebra, differential equations, intermediate differential equation is more like a dynamical system, and even higher level partial differential equations. We have, I have some banks that I'm willing to share. I don't mind to share. Okay.
Kristen, you brought up a good point of students are intimidated and they need
Yeah.
a lot of guidance. How do you do that? How do you make them less intimidated?
I think she says she is in a loud environment, so probably it's harder for her to talk. She may put it in chat.
I'd love to hear how. So if anybody else has ideas, how do you make people less intimidated to do real world problems?
In my idea, more open-ended problem is more troublesome for students. And if it's less open-ended, you give them exactly what you wanted, probably it's easier for them to follow along, and then they know what to ask. If it's open-ended, it's less guidance, then probably you have to guide them anyways. Then if it's too much, then just give them what you actually want them to learn from these projects. Of course, not what give them, but guide them, give them in the project descriptions, including specific expectations. Yeah, I think it's easier when it's not open-ended, but you can, I think the other professor who mentioned that she likes students to design their own based on their interests. And I think that's a good idea for higher level students. When students are at junior, senior level, they have their own interests, they exposed enough of the application problems, then they can come up with a really good projects on their own. You just tell them, you have to give me a model that's a system of linear equations. They can come up some engineer background, biology background, but for lower level students, probably group them up, give them more detailed step requirements so that they know what to ask.
So to highlight something that I think I'm hearing and underlying what you're saying is start out maybe structured and become less structured over the semester so that students are growing more used to the idea of a big open question that they can just answer themselves.
Right. And like the numerical methods I teach, normally it's junior, senior class. And first two projects usually is more structured, but the final project is always open-ended. Pick any project you like, focus on any of the topics we covered, and give me a presentation. And then usually students come up with really good topic you'll never imagine. But at beginning, it should be less open-ended.
Any other ideas on how to make students feel more comfortable?
Certainly one way would be to model what you want by doing something similar in class. Not the same thing, but by really going through the steps that you're intending them to do. I'm remembering what level. I think that we've been hearing that from everyone, but remember what level the students are, what your goals are. But I think the first time through, walk them through something similar, send them off, and then raise the ante as you go through the class. I think it's really important. So I haven't heard anyone say coding and software. I'll just put that one out there as a big barrier that I have no idea how to, well, I have some ideas how to solve, but not in a class where modeling isn't the first thing.
Very good question. How do you get across being able to use coding in different softwares that maybe you just don't really have the time to actually teach them about?
Coding is not something you can teach someone in short time.
Very true.
Yeah. So sometimes if it's numerical methods, I have to ask them to code. But if it's not coding related course, I have to give them the code if I want them to produce something from computer, or give them a code that's solving a similar problem, asking students to read the code, read the problem, and twist it. But not many students were able to read someone else's code to understand the algorithm behind it, to change it in the language I gave to them. It's really hard if you are actually asking them to use a computer language. And if, like you said, if you wanted them to learn modeling, focus on modeling, give them the code.
I like that explicit. Focus on the modeling, give them the code that they need. I think that's a nice way to put it. Because it seems that some people focus on the actual writing of the differential equation or other type of model or such. Some people focus on having students being able to solve that and then being able to interpret it. And I know some people seem to emphasize somewhere in that spectrum one thing over the other. That's not necessarily a question. That's just a statement that I was saying. Definitely. Coding, I've always found coding to be difficult for myself. I'll put that out there. I get kind of frustrated with coding sometimes. But there's a bunch of different like online tutorials for coding as well. But that puts an extra load on the student, right? You're not saying like, oh, here's this code, go use it. This is go watch this video and
Yeah.
try to figure it out yourself. So maybe that's not a very good way to do that.
We use TAs. So we use R as our main coding. And so our TAs or our tutors have been very helpful for putting some of that burden outside of the class.
Oh, that's interesting. So you have specific people to help with the coding, like graduate students, teaching assistants?
Peers. So I'm at a strictly undergraduate institution. So
Okay.
peers, and in our math modeling class, we actually, our biological modeling, we pair biologists with biology majors with math or computer science majors. So hopefully there's a little bit of each one teach one going on. So we really, you know, we give them code or code to modify, but even so, as you said, Elizabeth, the frustration through the roof. And so having a TA or a tutor who's available to help with homework, help with finishing problem sets, just, you know, helps even the playing field and allowing the students to not get lost in some morass.
I mean, for me, what I do is like, because we don't have that graduate student facility, so I make my students work in a group even on codes. And when I'm deciding on the group, I make sure of the fact that because these classes are filled with people from different backgrounds. So many computer science students, students from statistics, they also take these modeling classes because of its being applied in nature. So I try to kind of pair students with those who have a little bit more background on coding. and then make them work in a group. So if something they get stuck into, they can take the help from their peers also. And I think this has worked with me since the last 2-3 years. And I am hoping to continue this for kind of some period of time until unless I venture into something different.
I don't know about that. I think that's a wonderful suggestion, is whenever you're making these groups, curating them to the students who have different backgrounds and strengths and weaknesses in different areas so that they can each complement each other instead of just making random groups. I think that's lovely.
And I think they learn much more. Like if they do it by themselves among the peer, the learning component kind of also increases rather than somebody showing them some code and running it in the class. If you do it with your own hand, I think that's where the coding experience comes from rather than seeing somebody working on a code.
Mm-hmm. Is it a common thing that people find that their students actually writing the differential equation is a difficulty? Or is that something you try to bypass?
What do you mean by writing differential equation? Like,
So if you're given a real world situation and you just say, model this situation,
mhm.
do you find that them actually writing out an equation is the hard part? Or is it something else?
Yeah, I would say writing that differential equation out explicitly by themselves is hard. But normally what we ask them is always based on what we discussed in class. So in class, we introduce them some model that we explain the simple background. And then we can ask them, what if you add more interactions between two species, then they have to add another term into the equation. So if you talk about that, I think they can come up with that term into the base equation that you gave to them. And you probably also want to ask them more specifically, what do you want them to consider? What do you want them to not consider? Or what kind of terms you want them to add into the model that they can solve? Because it can be really complicated that they are not able to solve, or it can be too simple, just like what you gave to them in the class. So you have to set a kind of a framework for them to fill in. If you had some example, they should be fine. But to explain it in their report is harder.
So you're saying that them actually explaining what the different terms in the equation in an actual report is a difficulty that you find?
To make it clear, define the variables, make assumptions, why did you consider this, not that, or that they don't know how to explain why that piece of equation makes sense, even though they probably understand each term, but they don't really have the idea of how to introduce their model in the mathematical way.
One of the things we do is have them draw, so we're drawing box and arrow diagrams and
Right.
what, and then they have to explain that. So they're getting ready for their writing.
Yeah.
Even before they write the equation or equation set. And if they've got to write that down and write the assumptions and justify their choices of parameters, if you've been doing that throughout the class, it's easier again than to write these things that they should write because you've been showing them how to do that.
Excellent. We are out of time. I want to thank everybody for showing and talking and discussing with us these different things. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you.